everyone. It's 11 a.m., so we are going to get started. George?
Well, good morning. I am George Trieste. I'm the director of the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project, better known as SPP-TAP. The project is run out of the Napa County Office of Education, and it's funded by the California Department of Education, Special Education Division. Welcome, everyone. I'd now like to introduce Connie Silver-Broussard, our Technical Assistance Coordinator, who will take it from here. Connie.
Thanks, George. Okay, before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about how you will communicate during this webinar. So you'll notice on the slide there, we'll be using the chat as a tool for communication, and we have your phone lines muted. Okay, so at various points in today's session, you will be invited to use the chat tool. And before we move on, I want to give everyone an opportunity to test using the chat tool by typing in a short message. So to do this, click your mouse into the box in the lower right corner of the screen, type your message, and then press enter. So go ahead and try this now, and I'm going to wait just a moment for people to post. Okay, excellent. So everyone's tried that out. Okay, so now we have a couple of housekeeping items to discuss. And first is just a reminder that this event is being recorded for archiving purposes. And then also just secondly, we will be sending out a brief follow-up evaluation survey, and that's going to be sent out via email, so keep an eye out for that. And next, I would like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Fergus. So Dr. Fergus is the Deputy Director of the Metropolitan Center for Urban Education at New York University. And he is coming to us directly from New York, downtown New York, so there may be some background noise, and I hope that you'll have some patience with that. If it gets really bad, we will take a short pause, okay? So Dr. Fergus has extensive knowledge in the area of disproportionality in special education and was one of two lead consultants contracted by the California Department of Education to develop the blueprint for our current State Performance and Technical Assistance Project. He has published various informative articles on disproportionality in special education and is the co-author of the Disproportionality Data Analysis Workbook, which is the focus of our presentation today. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Dr. Fergus.
Well, good morning, everyone. I have to remind myself it is morning for you all. It's early afternoon here, so hopefully there won't be too much background noise here. Welcome, everyone, to this conversation regarding the various tools that we have developed here at the Metropolitan Center for Urban Education in terms of disproportionality. As Connie mentioned, I definitely want to encourage using the chat box. I've become masterful, I think, at this point in terms of being able to pay attention to the slides and also paying attention to the public chat. So I look forward to seeing your comments, and I will be reading them and weaving them into my conversation. So as Connie mentioned, the focus of this morning's webinar is on this particular tool, or actually two tools that we have developed, focused in on how do we help school districts get to the root causes of disproportionality in special education and suspension. So I'm going to talk through the genesis of these tools, and as well as what have we learned along the way as we've been implementing this process. As a reminder to everyone, this webinar today is the first of two. Today is going to be much more of an overview of the tools, and then we have a follow-up webinar scheduled for January, early January, that provides you all an opportunity to have, for those of you who had an opportunity to manipulate the tools, to ask further questions as you've been using them. So as I mentioned, my objectives will be around the tools themselves, and more specifically, spending time talking about the in-depth data analysis process that's involved in this work on disproportionality and the levels, particularly the methods and the levels of data analysis. Real briefly, I want to provide a quick overview of how we got to this point in terms of having this tool. Our Technical Assistance Center on Disproportionality here is funded by the State Education Department in New York, and we're slated to work with school districts that the state has identified for being disproportionate in special education and suspension, which we all know affectionately as State Performance Plan Indicators 4, 9, and 10. We have been under contract with the State Education Department for 6 years now, doing this work. So we've been piloting these sets of tools with a lot of school districts throughout New York in direct and indirect ways. The ways in which we actually have been piloting and implementing this work has been through a couple of vehicles. We do district-level work and regional-level work. I'm going to talk real briefly about the district-level work. With each district, the state has mandated that we develop a team of around 25 individuals. And these individuals, it must contain general education teachers, board members, special education teachers, building-level administrator for each building, child study team chair, counselor, social worker, or mental health support staff, parents, and central administration of folks, particularly folks who are in charge of curriculum and instruction. And it's that team of 25 that we work with every school district for a 2 to 4 year period. As you'll see there, we worked from 2004 to 2009 with 13 school districts, 6 pilot districts that we initially started with. That was our first cohort where we actually tested all of the development of these tools and retested and retested. We were able to make gains in such a way that 4 out of the 6 pilot districts reduced their rates of disproportionality and were no longer cited by the state. By 2007, that the state asked that we actually take on 7 additional districts in 2007. And in 2009, we entered another 5-year contract with the State Education Department in which they asked us to now take on 16 school districts at a time. And our work is actually focused on working with these school districts over a 2-year period. Our next area of work is, as I mentioned before, we work at a district level and then we work at a regional level. In New York, there are 10 regions that are outlined throughout the state, and these regional teams are comprised of New York State Education Department funded technical assistance providers, as many of you are technical assistance providers. So the expectation the state has with us is for us to work with these TA providers and build their capacity around understanding disproportionality and addressing the issues of disproportionality within the districts that they are assigned to. So we have, so our experience comes from having worked directly with school districts, but also working with TA providers who ask just different types of questions in terms of this work. So let me begin talking about the process that we actually developed with our school districts. The process that we actually developed with our school districts, we've broken really into sort of these 4 particular layers. The first layer, which we call that initial data analysis, we call it the creation of a data book, which I'm going to walk briefly through what that looks like. Once we do that data book, which is vitally important that TA providers actually conduct before they enter their school district, we moved into our what we call our module series, and that module series breaks into these 3 particular areas where we begin by having deeper inquiry beyond the initial data that comes out of the data book. Then we go into looking at the types of practices and policies that the school districts and buildings have been implemented, and using a research strategy of examining data, particularly the data from the process and the data from the actual output and outcomes to see what are we seeing here are the patterns. And then finally, we focus in on what are the types of solutions based on the gaps that we see in the prior steps analysis that leads us to identifying the types of solutions that are necessary within a school district. So let's start with our first step, creating the data book. And for those of you who are math folks, Don't worry, we have made this as user-friendly as possible, and we actually do various workshops just on this workbook. We do these 4 to 6 hour sessions in getting folks comfortable in doing this level of workbook work. Because it involves different types of mathematical formulas, we provide as many case study opportunities for individuals to do that. So, in doing this this workbook, the workbook is primarily focused on how do you analyze special education suspension data. The way we've organized it is by paying attention to the 3 particular levels of special education data that generally occurs across many states. I have to mention that the 3 levels that we've outlined here are based on sort of what we see nationally out of the research in terms of how researchers and practitioners have been analyzing their data. So first and foremost, obviously, we're talking about level 1, which focuses on the overall district classification rate. And the activity that we're going to do very briefly in a little while will do just that. You'll have an opportunity to actually do that calculation. Level 2 focuses on that same point in terms of classification rate, but now we're also looking at 2 other formulas, which includes composition index, relative risk ratio, but looking at those sets of patterns by race and ethnicity. And then level 3 looks at, again, looking at those same formulas, classification rate, composition index, and relative risk ratio by race ethnicity, but now we add in the elements of classification type, which we all understand, particularly the high incidence ones that many state education departments are particularly interested in, which are learning disability, LD, emotional disturbance, ED, and I just blanked, I'm sorry, in terms of language impairment. Those tend to be the 3 primary ones. We've actually been adding in OHI, other health impairments, because we're finding that school districts are no longer using as often emotional disturbance, but are actually using OHI via recommendation of an external psychologist or pediatrician. So, in order to do this analysis work, I'm going to stress this is important that as TA providers, before you walk into a school district, that you actually run the data yourself so that you clearly understand what is the pattern of disproportionality. And the way in which we do this is that here we've had an opportunity to actually build a relationship with the Data and Accountability Office at the State Education Department in New York. And they provide us every year a flat file of all the school districts in New York, their disproportionality, well, their special education, their suspension, and their enrollment data. So we actually do all the calculations for all of our school districts and are able to generate this workbook. As TA providers, I would suggest that you communicate with your state education department in terms of the mechanisms to acquire this set of data, or work with your particular school district to actually gather this data. When you have an opportunity to look through the workbook, you will see in the first couple of pages we provide folks an outline of what are the specific set of data that you need. I have here a couple of notes in terms of what types of data that you need. Obviously, you're going to need district enrollment data by race and gender. We consider including gender a very important variable to include because, as you all may know, that the patterns of special education and suspension tend to disproportionately lean towards boys. So it's an important variable for us to look a little bit deeper at, as well as having special education enrollment data by race and gender, classification, and placement. And then the other important piece around the data requirement is that you ensure that both sets of data, the district enrollment data and the special education enrollment data, as well as the suspension data, that it reflects the exact same school years. A lack of inconsistency may prevent appropriate analysis. So what are those 3 methods? These are the 3 most common methods that are conducted in terms of doing data analysis around disproportionality. Risk index or classification rate, composition index, and relative risk ratio. I'm only going to provide an example of the risk index or classification rate and I'm not going to do composition index or relative risk ratio. However, it is in your workbook, and I promise you it is very user-friendly to actually do your own composition and relative risk ratio calculation. So what are some of the questions that we explore in this overall risk question, that first risk index or classification rate, which is, in general, we're talking about what is the overall district classification rate or what is the overall district suspension of students with disabilities. And as you all know, those reflect indicators 9 and 4. What is risk index and classification rate? Well, it identifies the rate or the amount of risk a student of a particular racial ethnic group has in terms, is falling into a particular category. It's what is the rate in which black students are classified as disabled? What's the rate in which black students with disabilities are suspended? What is the rate in which Latino students are receiving A's and B's? One of the unique things about these formulas is that we also use it to do other types of calculations around other inequitable outcome patterns. So we actually also do it to look at the patterns of A's and B's, who's getting A's and B's more frequently than other groups, and you can look at a risk index to actually calculate that, as well as looking at honors and or AP courses. I see that one of the questions is around the workbook. You all will have access to the workbook. It's actually on our website. If you follow the link on the slide that has the workbook, at the bottom there's a link that takes you directly to our website that has the workbook available to everyone. So what is it? How do you actually do the overall risk? Well, here I wanted to provide you all a rough rendering of how you actually do this. So the classification rate is basically the number of students with disabilities divided by the total number of students times 100. Okay? So if you look here at this bottom example, classification rate equals, let's say you have 500 students who are students with disabilities, meaning students who have an IEP. You divide that by the total number of students. So you have 5,000. You multiply that by 100, and you get 10%. So in this example, we're talking about there's a 10% classification rate. Now, if this were to be a particular group, let's say if this were African American students, we could say these are 500. There are 500 African American students with classifications. Divided by 5,000 African American students in the entire school district times 100 equals 10%, meaning 10% of the African American students in this particular school district have an IEP. So I want to give you all an opportunity to sort of do your own quick calculation, and it's an opportunity for you all to see how easy it is to actually run these calculations yourself. So if for those of you who have calculators, or for those of you who are math geniuses, you can take out a pencil and paper, because I'm now going to show you a slide with some data on it for you all to run. So let's start with, these are 4 different districts up here. They represent different populations. So here we're talking about, this is a school district, or these are 4 different school districts, and looking at their district enrollment of just black students. So here in row A, we have district enrollments for all 4 districts. Row B represents the number of students with disabilities. What I'd like you to do is calculate your classification rate. So if you do B divided by A times 100, what would you get? I'm going to give you all a couple of seconds to do at least the first couple of districts. And if anybody would like to post on the public chat your answers, please feel free to do that. Well, thank you, Linda. That's for writing onto the public chat your answer. And yes, you are correct. And Dennis, thank you again. That's great. I'm glad to see you all did the quick calculation. So you all are correct. You have District 1 with 14%, District 2, 26%, 17% for third district, and almost 14% for the last district. And what's important for us to understand here in terms of these different rates is that it provides us one particular avenue in understanding what's the nature of disproportionality in a district. And as you can see here, particularly in District 1, let me back up a little bit. These numbers are, in New York State particularly, State Department has a concern for districts who have a 15% or above classification rate. And so District 2 and District 3 would be of concern here in New York. Nationally, the rates of classification rate, particularly, is around 12%, particularly for African American students. And the reason why paying attention to classification rate becomes important is because it provides us a lens to understand what's the rate of how often a particular group is actually is being classified. So in this example, if you look at District 2, we could say that 26% of the African American students in a particular school district are identified. Or another way that we also share it out with our school districts is to say that 1 in every 4 African American students in a particular school district is classified. And it's important for us to not only do these by looking at all groups together, but also doing it within these groups, which this example provides, because it allows you to really look at the different dimensions of classification rate, or particularly disproportionality. We've had some school districts that have rates that are particularly of African American students where they are 40 to 50% of their population is in special education. So once we do these calculations, we always ask them 2 very critical questions. What do you notice, and what may be possible explanations for what you're seeing here? And we try to keep it as sort of very rudimentary for our practitioners to understand this data, because one, we have some folks who obviously may get hung up on the numbers from the side of from a math phobia side, but we also have some folks who get hung up on a number because of what they feel as if it may be stating about their own practice. So as you look at these numbers, I'm sure you're asking yourself, sort of, what am I looking for? One of the things that we've tried to do with all of our school districts is provide them a chart that really gives them a sense of where they're at and how they are going to be, how their issue may be arising. So as you see here in row 1, the nature to which school districts are experiencing disproportionality can mean different things if you're looking at it just by risk index or just by relative risk ratio. So what we do in this table is actually provide a outline so that staff can understand how you can increase on one calculation but be decreasing on another and still be disproportionate. And that's because these sets of formulas provide a different slice of how to look at disproportionality. We encourage practitioners and TA providers to use all 3 sets of formulas because it's not one is going to give you the full dimensional understanding of how disproportionality is happening in the school district. So before I move on, I have to give a quick caveat in terms of the numbers. One is that it's vitally important that practitioners understand that what is leading to their issues of disproportionality are deep-seated, and it involves us needing to look a little bit deeper as to why these numbers are happening the way they are. And most importantly, making sure that practitioners understand that you can't fix the numbers by fixing the numbers, right? So in other words, just by increasing the rate at which you classify a particular group over another group is not going to fix your issue. So fixing the numbers you can't fix the numbers by fixing the numbers. You still can have a disproportionality issue. and it's important that there be great attention to explaining that to school districts, that it's not, this is an endeavor to understand the issue versus trying to just get off the list. I'm going to take a quick pause here to allow folks to ask any questions. I see one question here posed by Dennis in terms of how important is slope. I'm presuming that you're meaning it right in terms of the rate of change. Gotcha. Well, I think it depends on the particular calculation that you're using. From a statistical stance, the one that is of greatest concern in looking at the rate of change is the relative risk ratio. And that's because relative risk ratio is a ratio of ratios. So if you have one group and you're comparing it to all other groups, a shift in either group in terms of enrollment, in terms of classification or overall enrollment, can really throw off the ratio on either end of it. So when you look at the relative risk ratio over time, it becomes very problematic because you're going to have to account for those degrees of change that are happening due to shifts in number. So we actually have a colleague who's at the University of Buffalo, who's been working with some public health folks who do epidemiological work. I can never say that word. And one of the things that they're interested in is looking at how what it would necessarily mean to pay attention to a rate of change using the relative risk ratio because of that that sort of fluctuation that can happen. I see a question here from John regarding the use of the E formula. Yes, exactly. So your question is in terms of looking at these calculations at the district level. Thank you, John, because that reminds me, one of the differences between doing it at the state level versus the district level, which is where we do it at, is that the state does, I know particularly here in New York, they use a weighted formula to actually do their calculations because they recognize that you can't, it's not fair to compare a district with 400 kids to a district with 1.1 million. So they use a weighted formula to actually do that, and that's how they identify the risk, the type of risk that a particular district has. However, when you're working at a district level, as we are, we're just comparing a school district to itself. So there's no need to necessarily look at using some type of weighted formula. So using these three calculations is very appropriate within a particular school district. I see a comment here. In a district with a relatively small American Indian population, it appears that by exiting one student from special ed, the district will indeed eliminate the disproportionality issue. Please discuss. Yes, and that's we have to be mindful of the size of the end, the size of enrollment by particular school districts, because we have school districts that'll have, 3 Asian students and 2 of them are in special education, so they may get, identified. However, I should say, I know in New York here, and in various other states that I've been working with, their primary groups that they're paying attention to is African American and Latino students. So, so you have to be mindful in paying attention to the enrollment number for that particular district, both on the special ed side and also in terms of overall enrollment, to understand whether this is a true issue to be exploring around disproportionality. All right, I'm going to move on now. I think these are some great questions, and please continue adding questions as I'm discussing how we go deeper. So, obviously, the data book becomes a very rich platform to begin this work, and it's something that, as a TA provider, it provides us an initial lens before we walk into a school district, and it's also a point of conversation that we have with the superintendent prior to starting to make sure that they have a handle on what's the nature of their disproportionality issue. We always say we don't want the leadership to ever be surprised when we walk into the school district with their data books. We want them to see it before the entire team sees it. So what are we looking for, and what are we looking at here? So when we start going beyond the data book, our attention is to look at three particular dynamics. First one is around the school district policies, practices, and process. We understand that every district has mechanisms of how they do what they do and why they do it, and what our process focuses on, how do we, in terms of sort of outlining how a school district actually develops, implements, and evaluates their types of policies, their practices, and processes. But we also look at what may be some of the outputs and outcomes in relation to those practices and processes. So, for example, if one of our activities is that we ask the school district to look at, to outline what are the interventions, the research-based interventions that they may provide at a Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3. And then we compare those types of interventions to the actual students who are receiving those interventions. So we'll look at the output, or in regards to that, meaning we'll look at, well, how many kids are actually receiving X intervention in Tier 1 or in Tier 2, and then we'll also look at the outcomes. Well, what have been the outcomes of kids who are receiving X intervention at Tier 1 and Tier 2? And so that's sort of a quick example of how we look at the relationship between those two boxes. And then lastly, we recognize that there are community context conditions that are happening. Every one of our school districts has a unique character to what's happening, and it's important for us to acknowledge that that's coming into play into the school district in terms of how they have organized their policies, practices, and processes, and as well as what are the types of outputs and outcomes that they're actually paying attention to. So we've developed this manual, this root cause process manual, that provides that outlines a 5-part process that we've developed. And these are all modules that we've developed. And what you see in that particular manual is the PowerPoint, an explanation of each slide that's on there, as well as the activities that are tied to it, an explanation on those activities, and sample worksheets that we actually use. And I'm going to quickly walk through sort of these 5 steps, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what are some of the things that that districts bring up at each one of those moments. Now, before I start talking about the module series, I must highlight that as TA providers, and as TA providers, it's important that we recognize that as we are entering this conversation around disproportionality, that one, we recognize that disproportionality is a race-based outcome. So as facilitators, that are working on this issue, we have to have an understanding of the complexities of how race intersects with the schooling process. Your school districts will bring this issue up, not only race, but also in terms of poverty. So it matters a great deal, the level of comfort that you have around this issue. Additionally, recognizing that disproportionalities exist due to gaps in various sets of policies and practices. And so as facilitators, we have to have a handle in knowing how we understand these sets of processes that are happening in school. We find it very valuable that as facilitators, I know here in New York that we've all been practitioners. We've all been in the classroom or been in building administrators, so we have a lens to be able to ask particular questions because we have that experience. And lastly, understanding that disproportionality also can exist because the ways in which these gaps operate may affect everybody, but it's also the way in which it affects most of the populations that are vulnerable can lead to issues of disproportionality. So let's get started talking about the first module. So the first module focuses on understanding disproportionality, and the purpose of that module is just that. We want to make sure that folks understand the definition of disproportionality. They can outline the intent of IDEA, how disproportionality exists at a national, state, and local, and then finally, obviously, in terms of disproportionality being a race-based issue. So some of the content we cover, obviously, is around the definitions of disproportionality, the long-term effects of disproportionality, and methods of calculating disproportionality. So our activities, our first activity, which is a really getting to know you type of activity, and it's basically, it's about getting to getting the district team members to start thinking very concretely around how practices and policies can construct a disproportionality in a district. One of our next activities focuses on how do we understand the processes that we currently have in place in our school district. It's always fascinating to see our school districts when they break off into building teams and they do that activity, that even within the same building, you have different individuals with different roles and responsibilities and interpret the same process very vastly different. And then finally, obviously, the workbook. And the data workbook becomes that last anchor of this session, because we want to make sure that once that folks have not only sort of begun outlining what they do, but now they are beginning to have an understanding of what their disproportionality issue is. A major element of all of our modules is the homework. And I'm sure many of you are, as former practitioners, understand the importance of homework, that it provides an anchor for what you're currently covering, but also provides an opportunity to connect with what's next. So it is that scaffold. So our homework is really focused around doing another layer of examination. Our homework is about, we always say, our homework is another layer of the onion. So each homework is going to give you another layer for you to peel away. So, for example, this is our Icebreaker. It's actually a case study that we borrowed from the book that's at the bottom, Truth in Labeling. Actually, it's a monograph from the National Education Association. They published it in 2007, I believe. And it's a quick narrative that allows for our practitioners to really engage in this conversation rather quickly, actually. This next one is the activity that I mentioned before in terms of what are we doing at each step. So what we have our practitioners actually do is, these are 4 very generic steps in the pre-referral to classification part of the process. And we have our practitioners in their building teams identify what are the core questions that should be asked in this process. And then finally, our homework assignments. So our homework assignments, as I mentioned, is peeling away the onion. So this next layer that we have is about getting more specific now. So now we have a general sense of what's the disproportionality across the district. Well, now we want to understand, well, what does that look like within our buildings? So we have the homework assignments to focus on collecting special ed data, and these are some of the areas that we have them focusing on in terms of collecting race, ethnicity times gender data. We want to look at, so who you have classified, what are their academic performance levels of those students? Of particular interest is the academic performance levels of students prior to being classified. Because we want to begin documenting what has happened along the way. Another area is to collect in terms of what are the number of students who they have referred to the child study team, and the number of students who were referred that were also classified. So obviously we want to see, well, what becomes the referral to classification rate. And in terms of suspension, we do the exact same thing, looking at those sets of patterns. And then lastly, the homework is reading 2 articles around the interaction of race, ethnicity, poverty, community conditions, and educational practice. And we think we have found the articles actually really illuminating to maintain this thread of disproportionality as a race-based outcome. In our first modules, we engage such a rich conversation that it becomes important that we provide them an opportunity to think on their own about this, but also give them something else to sort of really chew on and digest in thinking about these issues around race and poverty and educational practice. So these 2 articles, which we have been able to download for free, we provide to our school districts and becomes their homework assignments. And they're relatively short and user-friendly enough that folks actually find them very illuminating. So some of the things that we are some of the common themes of what we hear in our in that first session is we tend to hear questions like, why doesn't the state and federal government look at poverty as an interacting variable and causing disproportionality? We have some practitioners who ask, are we racist or are we a biased system? they start to recognize, and some practitioners understand that there's gaps in their practices that are leading to these issues. Other practitioners also identify that there may be district policies that are enabling the disproportionality issue. So, for example, districts who identify some buildings to have self-contained classrooms, those 12-to-1 classes, and then, but yet other buildings are allowed to have an inclusion or co-teaching model. So Module B, in the manual that we developed, Module B was an actual, was a training session that we developed that focused in on helping them and actually collecting that data, but actually doing it in a workshop session. But what we actually found was that we found that some of our school districts actually benefited with us actually coming out to their school site and helping them building by building to collect that information. And what we found was that our school districts not only wanted to kind of have the help in collecting the data at their building, but they also wanted to have sidebar conversations about the first session. So what we ended up doing, and what we've done with our Module B, is to actually make it an opportunity for us to gain insights of a building culture, of each of the buildings that are part of the district team, and also collect the information, the data that they have as their homework. So obviously, so then there's a component in which you need to prepare for Module C, which is there's all this information that they're going to collect, and it's important that we actually do that calculation beforehand. Of particular interest is that, we have some of the forms that you all that were emailed to you previously, and that will be up on our website later on, provides you sort of what are the ways in which you can analyze that classification data and that discipline referral data. Additionally, we also, another place that we also have those forms of calculating the data is also in our workbook. And obviously, I can't stress reviewing the articles before you have the next session, Module C. So in Module C, we've really focused in on analyzing that set of data that they're bringing to the table. So they're really bringing that data that reflects that part of the process that's right before the child is brought to the child study team. So it's really reflecting the data from the problem-solving team or instructional support team or teacher assistant team to the point in which you actually classify a child. So that data actually provides you information about the outputs and outcomes of what's happening in that part of the process. Additionally, the other purpose of this session is that we begin this conversation around the relationship of poverty, race, and school practice. And I'll be honest, it is a very tough conversation to have. Because you will have practitioners who are on different sides of the spectrum, and we want to continuously encourage this conversation to happen, but to happen in a very healthy way. So, so as you're engaging those conversations, obviously as facilitators, I'm sure you understand the importance of having, outlining sets of boundaries for how we actually have those conversations. In our manual, we have examples of ways to actually create a contract that everybody agrees to on how we're actually going to engage this conversation that most school districts don't really have. So our content obviously is related to that in terms of definitions of poverty and race, and then also looking at the outcomes of school practice. Our activities, we actually go back to our critical questions activity, those 4 boxes that I showed you earlier. And this time, instead of having them look at what questions should they be asking, we actually have them outline, what do you actually do? So once that's a very critical activity that connects to the next activity, which is now we look at the data that they actually collected for their homework. So as you will, when we laid this out, they would have outlined their particular practices and processes of what they do in those 4 boxes, and then they will compare it to their output and outcome data that they collected for their homework. And it becomes very illuminating for them to see the relationship between what they're doing or what they're putting into their practice and what it's actually resulting in. And the last activity that we do is the community context data. Now we don't do this with all of our districts. We only have done it with a handful of school districts that have requested it. And it's mostly been school districts who have experienced what they call an influx of a new group. And they talk about a lot of presumptions that they have about this group. So what we've actually been able to do with districts like that is that we will actually pull their census data and actually do a quick analysis for them and provide them answers to, well, who is living in your community? In our manual, we actually have outlined there in Module C how you can actually go to the census website and download the information. So we give you step-by-step instructions in the manual. And then finally, for the homework, further data. It's peeling away the onion. So there are additional layers of onion peeling that we do. Now that onion peeling, we actually, there's a form that we call the data list form. It was emailed to you, that form, and it provides various areas of policy and practice data that we allow the district team to decide where else do they want to peel their onion. So we generally, as facilitators, have a sense of where we should push them. And so we tend to isolate sort of what are some of the non-negotiables. So for example, a school district that's been cited for indicator 4, they have to bring their code of conduct handbook that they have for their district, as well as the ones that they have for their buildings. We also have them pull their disciplinary referral form. So those become non-negotiable for the districts who have particular types of disproportionality citations. And then finally, the other homework is that we engage them around a climate survey that focuses on cultural responsiveness. And we've been using the NCREF survey, which is the National Center for Culturally Responsive Education Systems. And it's a survey that is actually publicly available, and I was told previously that you all will be receiving a webinar focused in on that survey. So I won't talk about that anymore. So here's the worksheet that we use that I mentioned before. Obviously this time we have them outline what are their activities. And then the homework assignment, the data list form. So this is just a quick example of some of the things that we have on that form that we allow for our district team to decide where else what are the other layers of the onion that they can peel. So at the end of Module C, these are some of the common themes that we tend to hear. Again, we keep hearing that same conversation around why doesn't the state look at poverty? Poverty is a strong conversation point that our school districts are having. And they're much more comfortable with having the poverty conversation than the race conversation. But as a facilitator, it's going to be vitally important that you're able to maintain this conversation, that you're able to talk about both in the context of what's happening in that school district's disproportionality issue. We also find that our school districts are beginning to understand that there may be particular cultural sets of values that are existing in their school practice of why they do what they do. And that those sets of values may not be explicitly outlined for all the populations in their school district. Obviously, we have school districts who continue understanding that there are gaps, as well as in practices and policies, and also understand that their district policies may be leading to the disproportionality issue. Then in Module D, we focus in on really sort of pairing all this information together. And this becomes a very worker-focused session. This is where we start analyzing so much more data that now it engages them to start isolating the possible root causes of their disproportionality issue. So the purpose becomes analyzing that data, continuing the conversation, doing some hypothesis work around root causes. So our activities, we have a critical analysis worksheet, which is just a generic template of all those data points that from the data list form. And what we added there is a couple of columns where we ask targeted questions of the data that they've collected and give them room to actually make notations as to what they note in that data that they've actually collected. And then obviously the activity that they do is looking at the survey data if they've taken the NCREF survey data is to see, well, in what ways are practices responsive to the populations that we have. And then finally, the homework for this session actually is we provide them, we want them to now begin connecting their root causes to what's the research saying out there. Because part of what we want to arm them with is an understanding that they're not alone in terms of the types of causes that are happening, and then two, to be able to substantiate their the root causes they're identifying with research. Because once they come out as a district team, they're going to need to start rolling this out district-wide, and it's important that they are versed enough in these issues that they can have a conversation with their colleagues around this. So some of the comments of the themes of conversation that occur, again, most of them are still saying the same. But it definitely becomes at this point when they start seeing the sets of various gaps in practices, as well as looking at their culture responsive survey responses, that they realize that there's what's happening in their building and how their kids may be responding is closely tied. So they start to understand the relationship between the two versus situating the cause of disproportionality on the kids or the community that they're coming from. And then lastly, Module E focuses on one, defining those sets of root causes clearly so we're all on the same page, and based on not only some of the research that they've done in the data, but also the readings that they've done as a group. And so the major activity is really what we call mapping root causes, and it's a worksheet that we have that allows for them to actually identify the various root causes. And then finally, the homework that we have is for them to outline their root causes in a report format that has all these layers of data, so they can be prepared to share that out with other with the rest of their school district colleagues. So I'm going to pause now to take some questions. So please use the public chat to pose any questions. I see a question there from Ellen. Do you recommend using the work of Ruby Payne to discuss poverty and educational practice? That's a great question. Ruby Payne's work has existed in many of our school districts, and they've done a lot of work around, obviously situating for school districts that poverty is a very substantive condition that kids are experiencing. The struggle that we find when we are working with school districts who have been engaging in the conversation that Ruby Payne provides is that it treats what kids are bringing to the table as something that needs to be fixed, and of particular interest is it doesn't provide a lens for us to really look at the wellness of the practice of what we're doing. It just focuses on what do we know about those kids and how poor people are, and so let's have the practice mirror what we think poor people behave like, versus us centering ourselves in what we know about good educational practice, particularly what we understand is the science of learning and teaching. Any other questions? Oh, here we go. So your question, John, in terms of at what point in the process you begin to develop the solutions to address the root causes. That's a great question. Actually, the solutions start getting developed from Module A. If right off the bat, our districts, because of the activities that we put them through, so for example, that first worksheet where we have them ask what is the critical questions that should be asked at each one of those junctures, right after that, we find that our teams are saying, we're not all on the same page. We need to fix this. So, so some of them actually go back and go to their building level teams, their grade level teams, and start making changes. So they're always, during the course of this whole endeavor, they're solution building along the way, which we don't stop them from doing, because they're recognizing that there are gaps here, and they're gaps that, they're seeing is based on the data that they have in front of them. the next question from Dennis is, would you recommend comment on under-identification disproportionality? Isn't this often a social justice issue as well? Yes, it is. Unfortunately, right now, from a federal perspective, there hasn't been specifications as to what is considered under-identification in special education specifically. And even further, there is less known in terms of how do we engage under-identification in terms of AP and honors, because when we look at disproportionality in special education and suspension, we have to think about the inverse. So if a group is ending up, if too much of a group is ending up in one situation, they're bound to be affected in terms of their representation in another area, particularly when we consider that, unfortunately, in educational practice, we see gifted and AP and honors as on the opposite side of special education, which, from a pedagogical point of view, doesn't make any sense, because you can have an IEP and still be an AP and honors. However, the jury is still out in terms of really how we are going to engage issues of under-identification. In our work, we do push with our school districts to collect data in terms of the enrollment patterns in terms of AP and honors. And even when they start examining the referral rate and the referral to classification rate, we are automatically also identifying under-identification patterns by the other groups who aren't having high referral to classification rates. Thank you for those questions. Those are really good. Those are the things that behind the scenes things that I always forget to include in my presentation. So I want to talk really quickly about a couple of caveats in addressing disproportionality. What are those things that our districts actually struggle with? One of the things that they struggle with is recognizing that it takes time for them to address this issue, right? Just as many years as it took them to get on the list of being disproportionate, it's going to take them that long to get off, right? So in this example here, you can see on the left side, the classification rate for this particular school district, you see that there's a decrease in each of those groups in terms of the disproportionality pattern, in terms of their classification rate. However, when you look at the relative risk ratio, I know here in New York, the relative risk ratio is used as the identifier, the formula is used for identifying school districts. So, but what you'll see there is actually the Latino groups appear to be rising. But the reality is that that's only occurring because if you look at back again at the classification rate, the white students' classification rate is has gone down at a faster rate. So therefore, because relative risk ratio is a ratio of ratios, that rate has actually affected the risk ratio. So it appears as if Latino students have a greater risk, but that may not be the case. Another caveat that districts struggle with, or at least I should say we struggle with as facilitators, is that some of our districts have learned to game the process. In the 6 years that we've been working with our various school districts, we've only had 2 districts who've actually gamed the process. And I mean by they've actually increased the rate at which they classified their white students and have been able to get off the disproportionality list. And so this actually is a true example of one of the 2 school districts that we've struggled with, that we're no longer working with, because as you see on the left side, they all had an increase. Well, the classification rate for all groups continued to increase. However, if you look at the white students, their classification rate pattern is their rate is a little steeper than the rest of the groups. Well, the effect has been, if you look on the right side, the relative risk ratio for black students has actually gone down during that same period. So it appears as if black students have a decreased risk. But in actuality, what the school district was actually doing in terms of a practice was that they were actually classifying their white students much faster. So, so the effect was that you had black students appearing to have a lower risk in that particular school district. I'm going to pause again to take any questions that any of you have. I see that we've actually just hit our time frame, 3 o'clock. or 3 o'clock my time, I'm sorry, 12 o'clock your time. I want to just leave you all with the next slide, which talks about the additional resources. One of the thoughts that I had as been thinking about your role as facilitators in this work is, well, what are the things that it's important for you all to feel comfortable around in terms of disproportionality? So I have here sort of some of the books and articles that we think are, and all of my staff here we've all become very versed in and understand the dimensions of disproportionality. We have a much more extensive list of articles and books that are related to disproportionality that exist in our manual as well, so you can look at that. But these are some of the things that we consider are in some ways, sort of the non-negotiables. Make sure you read these. So if there aren't any more questions, I want to thank you all for participating today. You've been a captive audience. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Fergus, for a wonderful presentation. I do want to remind everybody that this will be archived, and we'll send out a notice via email when it's available. And also that in 2 weeks, or actually it's a little bit more than that because of the break, so January 5th is when we are going to have our follow-up teleconference with Dr. Fergus, and that's at 1 p.m. Pacific time. So you'll have an opportunity to think some more about what you've learned today, perhaps read some of the articles and books that he's recommended, and have another conversation.